Okay, so we are back with Chaucer. Chaucer is here in spirit as well as in text. And and from time to time when I read some of Chaucer, Chaucer is a living presence among us. So we have been talking about the general prologue, the construction thereof, and Chaucer's various functions in the general prologue in our previous segment. And so now we're moving into the description of the Knicht, or the knight. So let's look at this in some detail. A Knicht there was, and that a worthy man. This is a worthy man. Chaucer is very impressed with this guy. But also you will notice as he goes along and talks about other men as worthy men, he from time to time will be ironic. But here he's not. This is perfectly straightforward. That fro the team that he first began to readen out, he loved chivalry. You know what chivalry is. And it's the kind of thing that you find still celebrated in books and movies and whatnot. Truth and honor, freedom and courtesy. And the footnote here talks about truth as integrity and freedom as generosity of spirit, but also courtesy, another word that comes in from French. Courtesy in our sense, but it meant more than just courtesy in the sense of holding the door for somebody or being polite to people. It did include those things. But it also was considered in the Middle Ages to be a whole way of living your life. To think in terms of being considerate towards other people. That's really what courtesy is. And forms of politeness were simply ways of acting out your being considerate towards other people. For worthy was he in his lordes were. By the way, the R's are trilled, either heavily when they're double R's or lightly when they're single R's here in Middle English. As well in Christendom as heathenesse, and ever honored for his worthiness. Well, then we go down through a list in which we see all of the battles that this guy has actually fought in. And it's a very impressive list of some of the more important battles of this time. And then in 61, at mortal battles. Mortal? Well, battles in which people got killed. And in many cases, a lot of people got killed. Had he been 15, and so forth. And so we go on and we have more and more of his description in terms of what he has done until we get down to line, let's see, 67. And evermore he had a sovereign priest. He had a terrific reputation. And then notice what follows this. And thuch that he were worthy, he was wise. Even though he was a worthy knight, he was also wise. Now, notice there's going to be a kind of paradox here. The knight is truly a big, tough guy, right? I mean, he would be sort of like a professional football player. He's a really tough guy. But at the same time, look at the other qualities that this same man has. He's wise, and of his port, as meek as is a maiden. As meek as a maiden? What are we talking about here? He never yet no villainy ne saide in all his life, unto no manner wicht. He never spoke harshly or badly to anybody of any station, even people of stations lower than himself. He never tried to lord it over anybody. That's the important thing here. He was a very perfect, gentle knecht. Well, already there's a kind of odd mixture of qualities. Well, let's see what else we have. But for to tell you of his array, his horse were good, but he was not gay. And what that means is he's on a good horse, but he's not on anything that's special. You know, it's like he's driving a Chevrolet. He's not driving a Lexus. You know, he's not trying to lord it over people. It's a perfectly good horse, but he doesn't have some great neat horse with all kinds of finery on it and so forth. Nor does he have finery on himself, as we shall see. Of fustian, he weared a japon, all besmattered with his haubergeon, for he was later come from his viage and went for to down his pilgrimage. So what does he have? He has this smock. You may wonder, what did knights wear under that ringed mail? Well, the ringed mail was made out of iron, and it was rough, and it would be very abrasive on your skin, and could even cut your skin. And so what people wore underneath it was a heavy woolen smock. A heavy woolen smock. And that would be between their skin and the ringed mail. He has taken off his mail shirt, but he still has that smock on, and it's all besmattered. Okay, it's got all of the road dirt and dust on it. Now, what would it look like? Well, if you assume, let's say that I were the knight, if you assume that I had been wearing a coat of mail, would have all those interlocking rings, right? And I'm out there riding around in the roads and the fields and the mud and the dirt and the dust and whatnot, and all that stuff is coming up and getting on me. Well, when I took off my coat of mail, it would leave a pattern, wouldn't it? Of all that dirt and dust and mud and whatnot. And he hasn't even bothered to change before going out on his pilgrimage. That's the kind of guy he is. Now notice, he is the highest ranking person, as I mentioned last time. He's the highest ranking person among the Canterbury Pilgrims. And he could very easily lord it over the others if he wanted to. But notice that he is as meek as a maid. So, what's going on here? Even the way he is dressed tells us something about his character. Character in both senses of character. He's a character in a story, that sense of a character, but he's also someone who has character, in the sense of someone who has good character. The way in which sports announcers use the term character. You know, some big defensive tackle comes in and knocks down the quarterback, and John Madden says, that guy's got real character, when the quarterback, you know, scrambles back up to get back into the play. That guy's got real character. In other words, strength of character. Okay, so that's what this guy has. He's got real character. And he has a genuine kind of humility. So, this is very different, by the way, from Beowulf. It's very different, isn't it? The culture has undergone a significant change by this time. And I was talking about that a couple of sessions ago when we were talking about the development of courtly love and the whole culture of courtesy and so forth. We're going to get into that a little bit more in just a moment with the description of the squire. And with him there was his son, a young squire. Now, in terms of how people would work their way up the ladder, if you were the son of a knight or the son of a duke or even the son of a king for that matter, you would start out, maybe not the son of a king, but the others would start out more or less at the bottom, in the service of the court. And they would be learning the ropes, as it were. And then gradually, they would not only learn the protocols of the court, but they would have teachers or tutors who would be teaching them all of the basic subjects that you were supposed to know. And in addition to that, the ones who were going to be trained for knighthood would be trained in how to use arms, so that eventually they could be granted arms in a formal ceremony. So that's our young squire here, who also is a lover and a lusty bachelor. He's a lover and a lusty bachelor. Bachelor, not exactly in our sense of bachelor, it simply means young man. But he appears not to be married, so also in our second sense of the term bachelor. With locks crula, as they were laid in pressa. In other words, he has curly hair. He's got this mass of curly hair. And as if they were laid in a press. What on earth is that all about? Well, during the later Middle Ages, and this continues, by the way, into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and then later on with wigs for men. Men, not all men did this, but many men would actually have some servant who would come in and put curling irons on their hair and curlers on their hair in order to make it curly, because this was considered very fashionable for men of the upper classes. Not men of the middle and lower classes, but men of the upper classes. So that the length of one's hair became a kind of class distinction. Men of the upper classes had longer hair and more luxuriant hair. Men of the lower classes tended to have shorter hair. Well, for various reasons. One would be that if you had long hair, it could get in the way in your work. Also, it was something associated with the military, especially with the lower ranks in the military, because it was a matter of hygiene. When you're out in the field, you can keep your hair and your scalp cleaner if you have shorter hair than if you have longer hair. And you're not able, let's say, to bathe as regularly as you might want to if you're in the middle of a war. So, okay, whereas the members of the upper classes probably could. I mean, they would carry with them a lot of the luxuries of people of their class and station. And that continued, like in the 17th century, the English Revolution between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers were people who were loyal to and often associated with the king. And they are in paintings depicted, I'm talking about the men now, well, the women too, but the men now had long, curling, luxuriant hair that would come down around their shoulders. Whereas the Roundheads were called Roundheads because their hair was cut relatively short. I don't mean that they were scalped, but they're cut relatively short so as to make one's head looked roundish. So later on, the fashion of wearing wigs came to be adopted. and that continued into the 18th and even a little bit into the 19th century, and then continued in the English law courts, continuing with the wearing of wigs, I think, still in some ceremonial occasions. So, okay, so he's of 20 year of age, he was Igessa. His father probably twice that at least. Of his stature, he was of even length. He's of fairly average height. And wonderly deliverer, and of great strength. He's a very agile, physical guy. And he had been some team in Chivachia, in Flandres, in Artois, and Picardy, and borne him well as of so little space, in hope to standen in his ladi grassa. He's done well in the military encounters in which he is engaged, but what's his motive? In hope that he would stand well in his lady's graces. Ah. And brooded was he, as it were, a maida, as full of fresh flowers, wheat and reda, singing he was, or floating all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May, associated with love and lovers, by the way. May Day, maypoles, May Day rituals, and so forth, throughout Europe, but especially Northern Europe, associated with love, lovers, falling in love, fertility, and so forth. Short was his gown, with slaves long on weeda. Well could he sit on horse on fair rida. He could a songas mock and well indita, just and egg dansa and well portray and rita. In other words, he had all of the gentlemanly accomplishments that a young man of his age and station was supposed to have. So hot he loved that be nechter tala, he slept no more than doth a nichten gala. Okay. Night times, you know, this hot, young, passionate lover slept no more than does a nightingale, whatever that means, by the way. Nightingales apparently don't sleep very much, and that's why they're called nightingales. Cortes he was. Notice his father was also known for his cortesia. Lowly and servizable, and carved before his father at the table, as he was supposed to. And he's probably very close to being knighted himself. Okay, so you could actually be knighted in your late teens or early 20s, sometime, you know, roughly in that period. You know, roughly the age at which people who go to college directly out of high school, roughly sometime during that period would be the time that you would be knighted, usually. Now, there could be people who would be knighted earlier, but that would be pretty unusual unless you were a prince, you know, and then you could be knighted by the king at any time. Or there were exceptions of people who were knighted later because of extraordinary service that they had performed. So, okay, so let's jump a little bit, if we can go over to the slide here. Let's see, are we going to the PowerPoint, please? Okay, the Squire. Courtly love. Let's talk a little bit more about courtly love. The models. Andreas Capellanus, whose name means, from Latin, André le Chapelain. He was Andrew, the chaplain, who's a priest. And he wrote a book whose English title is The Art of Courtly Love. That's how it's usually translated. De Arte Honesti Amandi is its Latin title, but The Art of Courtly Love. And in that, among other things, Andreas gives the rules for lovers and how you know if somebody is a true lover or not. So that someone who is a true lover will have his heart palpitate at the sight of his beloved. He will turn pale. He can neither eat nor drink. He can't sleep. And he will go out lonely at night, singing his song to the nightingale. This is the courtly lover, by the way. The courtly lover also, according to Andreas, falls desperately in love with his lady love and is forever in love with her and is forever then her servant. So that, remember when I was talking about this briefly before, in the courtly love ethic, the woman is placed, as we came to say, on a pedestal, and the man pays court to her. That's where that comes from, by the way. He pays court to her. And there's actually a social basis for this in that this whole movement developed around the time of the Crusades, when a lot of the men were away fighting on the Crusades. I'm talking about European men now. And so the women were left in charge. And so the guys who were the poet singers were of a lower class than the women, and they depended upon the women for their patronage. And so they composed these poetic songs to the women in which the women were described, first of all, as madame, or madam, madame, my lady, which actually is a social designation of the high station or high class of the lady, and would ask the lady to condescend to even look at the man, much less to grant him her love. Excuse me. And so Andreas says, by the way, that marriage, in the sense of being married, is no excuse for not loving, which is a wonderfully ambiguous statement. But what he seems to mean here, certainly what he was taken to mean, is that one's lady love, or gentleman love for that matter, may already be married to somebody else, or one may already be married oneself. And the usual argument about this in terms of social context is that among the upper classes, marriages were often arranged marriages. Now, among the lower classes, paradoxically, people pretty much had the choice of whom they would marry. Why? Because not very much was at stake in terms of station, property, money, position, politics, and so forth. Whereas among the members of the upper classes, far too much was at stake to let a couple of teenagers with their raging hormones decide who was going to get married to whom. You know, you're talking about vast fortunes in some cases being at stake. In some cases, you're talking about the history of nations being at stake. You can't leave that up to the people involved, unless the people involved are, you know, very substantial adults themselves. So most marriages took place quite early, And most marriages among people of the upper classes were arranged marriages. Not all of them, but most of them tended to be. So then, let's say that one were married to somebody. In some cases, the people hadn't even met until they met in church for their marriage ceremony. Now, that didn't happen all the time, but sometimes that actually did happen, according to surviving records, at any rate. That's a very, very, very unusual concept from our point of view, given that we have such different views of these things in our culture. But in any event, the purpose of marriage then was to bring together two families, largely for political and economic reasons, and of course to produce heirs. But having fulfilled one's obligations to producing heirs, what was to prevent people from falling in love with somebody else? Or at least that was the idea in this ethic of courtly love. Now, did this actually get practiced in real life? Who knows? Most historians nowadays are very skeptical that this really influenced the behavior of people in real life. But in the literature, you find all over the place, in the romances, people falling desperately in love when these are, quote, forbidden romances, right? Think of Lancelot and Guinevere. Well, Lancelot and Guinevere fall desperately in love with one another, but there's only one problem. Guinevere's already married. And she's not only already married, but she's already married to King Arthur, who is not only the king, and therefore the lord, to whom Lancelot owes his fealty, but also Arthur is Lancelot's best friend. So you've got all these complications going on there. Love versus honor being one of the commonest themes in the Romance literature, starting in the 12th and 13th centuries. And then you have stories like Tristan and Isolde, another great pair of lovers in the Middle Ages, subject of many romances. Well, Tristan and Isolde fall desperately in love with one another. Once again, the problem is Isolde is already married. She's married to King Mark, who is not only the lord to whom Tristan owes his fealty, but also he's Tristan's friend. These are best buddies. So again, you've got a conflict between love and honor. And notice the torments of the lovers. See, the lovers try desperately not to fall in love, but then, of course, they do fall in love. And then they try desperately not to get together, but of course, they do get together. And then finally, typically, they end up going to bed together, but then something happens and they either feel guilty or they're found out or they're about to be found out, because after all, this is a very dangerous situation, and it's physically dangerous. Not just talking about a scandal, we're talking about people getting their heads cut off. So it's a very dangerous situation, and so what happens typically in these romances is that the lovers are constantly having to be parted, either by their own decision or somebody else's decision. And so we really don't see the lovers coming together very often at all. Most of the time, what we're experiencing is their frustration at not being together. And they're yearning for one another when they're not together. And then if they do get together again, it will only be fleetingly. And then, of course, they are parted again. Well, you wonder in these kinds of romances, well, why don't you just arrange things in such a way, if you're the author of the romance, why don't you just arrange things in such a way that they can get married? Well, then notice you would lose all of that tension, right? I mean, the romances depend to a large extent on that tension of frustration and of unfulfillment. And that apparently is part of what makes them so popular. I'm not talking about popular romances in our time. I'm talking about medieval romances. But that's a tradition that continues for a very, very, very long time, many centuries. Okay, so once again, do we know that this was acted out in actual life? Who knows? Who knows? We're talking about literature here. We're talking about art here. Do people really live their lives according to the patterns that we experience in lots of movies? Probably not. Right? But we enjoy the fantasies that we engage in movies, and no doubt earlier audiences enjoyed at some kind of imaginary level the experience of entering into the world of romance. So that if we can go back to the PowerPoint, please. We have two very famous cases, one being Chrétien de Troyes, who was a famous romance writer, French romance writer, obviously, who wrote Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, because the knight lover was supposed to give extremely elaborate demonstrations of his love, of his proof of love, so that he would be deemed worthy by the lady of her love being extended to him. There's one point in Lancelot, or the alternative title, the Knight of the Cart, in which Lancelot hesitates just for a couple of seconds before he jumps into a dung cart, into the dung cart, en route to Guinevere. She finds out, and for that hesitation, she says, "I cannot believe that you are a true lover." Well, that kind of thing happens all the time in the romances. And then if we can go back to the PowerPoint, please. Guillaume de Lorry and Jean de Meun wrote a famous runaway bestseller in the Middle Ages, the Roman de la Rose, in which there's a kind of allegory. In the rose garden, here is the rose, and the rose is the lady. And the lover, Amans, seeks to possess the rose. And he has to learn, he tries, by the way, to seize the rose, the lady being the rose. The rose, by the way, traditionally being a symbol for female sexuality, not only romance, but also female sexuality. And so, and certainly in the Roman de la Rose and in medieval romance, that's true. And so he tries to seize the rose and, of course, is rebuffed. And so for the next 20,000 lines of this poem, or thereabouts, he has to go through elaborate education in how to deal with women. And how you deal with women is you have to learn courtesia. You have to learn courtoise, la vie courtoise, a whole way of living according to courtesy and the rules of courtesy, before he can finally possess the rose. So, some of the characteristics of courtly love, then, as I've already mentioned, but just by way of summing up, placing the lady in an elevated position as Madame, The male lover pays court to his lady and enters into her service. This is what courtship means. You know, you've heard the term courtship. We still use the term courtship. That's what this goes back to. And then, of course, the physical signs of his love: sleeplessness, turning pale, heart palpitating, his being unable to eat. He's wasting away. He often says that he is dying for his love. Would she please have mercy upon him, lest he simply waste away? Notice that eros tends to be sublimated. Eros in the sense of sex or sexuality tends to be sublimated. It tends to be transformed into something else. And by that I mean that love here is seen to be a refining quality. You become a better human being. You grow as a human being, ethically grow, morally grow, through being in love. So eros, or sexuality, then is sublimated into this whole development of character. Okay, back to the screen, please. Frustration and complication may lead to fulfillment. But as I said a few moments ago, fulfillment, and here by fulfillment I mean sexual fulfillment, often leads to further frustration and complication, unless the lovers marry. And in the English romances, as distinguished from the continental romances, the lovers often do marry. Or they part without testing their love any further. And we're going to see an example of that in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Okay. One of the things, of course, that you can't have is you can't have Lancelot and Guinevere getting married, and then you find them 5 years later in the kitchen with the children throwing cereal at one another. You know, how can that be romance? So when you do have the lovers marrying, the marriage is typically the end of the story, right? And then you have some little wind-up like, oh, they lived happily ever after, without, you know, getting into the children throwing cereal at one another in the kitchen. Because we're not going to pursue that. Okay. So, that's our Squire. See how he acts out a lot of those characteristics of courtly love? And then we have with them a yeoman who is not only a kind of servant, but also in battle, he would have a specific function, which would be something like a sergeant. Not exactly, but something like that in relation to the knight being a kind of officer, to use an analogy with our kind of military. But then let's look in our remaining minutes at the nun, a prioress, a prioress. She is the head of a community of religious women, of nuns. Now, let me just say at the outset that you didn't have to become a nun. Now, in some cases, there were instances where a woman would be put in a convent for some reason or another. That's what happens to Guinevere, by the way, at the end, is she's sent off to a convent to pray and repent of her sins. But, you know, one normally did not have to become a nun or become a monk, for that matter. So one, generally speaking, did that of one's own free will. Now, having said that, then let's see how people behave. There was also a nonna, a prioressa, that of her smealing was full simple and coy. Simple and coy? What is this? Simple and coy. Okay. Her greatest oath was but be Saint Loy, which is nothing in particular. And she was cleped Madame Eglantine. Madame the Elegant One? Madame Elegant? Well, okay, here is somebody very unlike the knight. This is a woman who likes to put on airs. She's not a bad woman, by the way, but she likes to put on airs, as we shall see. Full well she sung the service divina, intuned in her nose full samely. This nasal quality was considered to be very fashionable and also very upper class. En French, she spake full fair unfetisly, as members of the upper class would. But then notice the little ironic comment here. After the skull of Stratford at the Boa, for French of Paris was to hear un canoa. In other words, she spoke a kind of rural, provincial French, not the real thing, okay, not Parisian French. So here's an instance in which Chaucer as poet, Chaucer as author, is stepping back. He's distancing himself, isn't he? He didn't do that with the knight. He really got into his description of the knight. The knight is a terrific guy from his point of view. But here he's having fun with the prioress. At Meta, well, he talked was she withal. She let no morsel from her lippes falle, no wet her fingers in her sauce dapa. Well, could she carry a morsel and well cape, that no drop ne fell upon her breast, in courtesy was set full mutual here lest. Her over lip weeped she so kleine, that in her coppa there was no fairer thing saner of grace, when she drunken had the draught, and so forth. Okay, now, that description, as some Chaucer critics discovered quite a number of years ago, is taken out of the Romance of the Rose, or Roman de la Rose, in the instruction that an older woman is giving to young women who are trained to become courtesans. Now, the position of a courtesan was a professional mistress to an upper class man, some duke or king or whatever it might be. And so here is this woman who is training young women to be courtesans for noble men. And among other things, she is training them in proper table manners. And Chaucer is taking almost word for word that passage out of the Roman de la Rose and inserting it here into his description of the prioress. How many people would have gotten that? Not everybody, certainly, but some would. Remember, the Roman de la Rose was a kind of bestseller in the Middle Ages. And even though not everybody knew how to read and write by any means, people would hear these things read aloud to them. This, once again, is the power of allusion that I was talking about before in connection with Beowulf. How a poet, a writer, novelist, whatever the person may be, or other kind of artist for that matter, may be able to allude to some other cultural work which is sufficiently well known, at least to parts of the audience, for them to catch the illusion. And in this case, the people who would catch the illusion would find this vastly amusing, because it's put into the description of a nun. Okay. And it painted here to contrafete cera, to counterfeit the manners of court, unto ben statlich of maner, unto ben holden digne of reverenza. But for to spaken of her conscience, yeah, let's talk about her conscience. I mean, after all, this is a nun, right? What about her conscience? What about her moral sense? She was so charitable and so piteuse. Pite in French and also in Middle English means fellow feeling. She wold awape if that she saw a moose caught in a trap, if it were dead or bred or small a hundas had she that she fed it with roasted flesh or milk and wastel bread, but sore wept she if one of them were dead, or if men smote it with a yerde smerta. So she has all kinds of pity towards animals. But what about human beings? And notice what she's feeding dogs. She's not even supposed to have a dog, as a nun, by the way. And she's feeding them all the best food, when there are people all around in 14th century England who are starving to death, or who, as a result of their malnutrition, are becoming susceptible to terrible diseases. And then we get to how she's dressed and what she looks like. And notice how the Chaucer figure, who of course is male, is describing her. She's sexy. I mean, she's very attractive to him. Nothing wrong with that, of course. Nothing wrong with a woman being attractive, obviously. But she's a nun. And here she seems to be going out of her way to make herself very feminine and very attractive. Okay? And so we see, even in his response then, the irony that this poet narrator is capable of. Well, more of this anon.